Okay, we've got a new link, but waiting for people to come to it. We're waiting for people to be transferred over. I guess that's what Paul's doing. Oh, I can go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this book launch put together by Historical Materialism Journal and Haymarket Books. And we don't have big intros at Historical Materialism typically, so I will just say a few words. I think it's important to mention the book that we are launching, which is Cat Moir's Ernst Bloch's Speculative Materialism, Ontology, Epistemology and Politics. Now, this book launch is a little belated. The book originally came out in one of those great big fat Historical Materialism book series, Brill hardbacks, 2019, I think, and then 1 year later as a slightly slimmer Haymarket paperback. So it's an extraordinary study, as we're going to hear tonight, of Ernst Bloch's materialism, a new interpretation of his philosophy, a setting of him within the intellectual milieu from which he comes and within which he operated, but also it speculates forward as to the lasting legacy and implications of Bloch's philosophy. I first encountered it in a different form even further ago, not that long ago, but at Sheffield in its version as a PhD back in the day. So Cat now lives in France, where she's studying psychology, and she's also an honorary senior lecturer in German at the University of Sydney. We are also joined by Sebastian Truskolaski, who teaches in German studies at the University of Manchester, and he, I'm sure, is well known to many of you for his work around Adorno and Benjamin, in particular the book that came out not so long ago about Adorno and the ban on images. We have Thomas Tilios, who's in the philosophy faculty at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, who is also an expert in critical theory, feminist philosophies and other matters. And we have Helena Sheehan, who's Emeritus Professor at Dublin City University and has written a number of books, but most pertinent for this context is Marxism and the Philosophy of Science, and the more recently published Navigating the Zeitgeist. So What we're going to do this evening is let Cat say a few words to position her book, and then Helena has some questions she's going to pose, and they will have a dialogue about that. Then we'll move to Sebastian, who also has got some questions he wants to debate with Cat. And then finally, Thomas will be in discussion with Cat. After that, we'll take in the questions that come through the chat. But I encourage you to put them into the chat box on YouTube as they occur to you, as the discussion comes through, and our wonderful assistant will be funneling them through to us so we can draw those questions into our discussions and debate. So let me just start then by handing over to Cat to position or say what she would like to say about the book.
Thanks a lot, Esther, and thanks to Historical Materialism for hosting this event. As Esther mentioned, the book has been out for a little while now, and I was hoping to have an event last year in between the publication of the hardback and the paperback, and because of the pandemic, that wasn't able to happen. So I'm very happy to be able to talk about it today with everybody online, and also, of course, with my participants who've agreed to engage with me on some of the issues that it raises. So thanks to Helena, Sebastian, and Thomas for being here as well. When I started working on Bloch back in 2009, 2010, which seems like a long time ago, Esther said it doesn't seem like long ago, but to me it really does. That was a period when speculative realism and speculative materialism were kind of philosophical buzzwords. There were a number of publications, Contemplaire sous After Finitude. There was big edited volume, The Speculative Turn, on the topic. The journal Collapse was publishing stuff around these concepts. And I was rather interested in speculative realism and materialism on its own terms. I was reading some of that stuff and found it interesting and challenging. And I was also at the same time reading Bloch and working on Bloch for my dissertation. And in particular, one of the books of his that I was quite involved with, and which is the center of my book, was his Das Materialismusproblem, seine Geschichte und Substanz, the materialism problem, its history and substance, which he wrote during the 1930s when he was in exile from fascism, was published first in West Germany in 1972. And in that book, Bloch's Materialism book, he develops a position which he calls speculative materialism, and we'll hear more about that today, I'm sure. And I was kind of, curious to know whether there was any connection between Bloch's philosophy of speculative materialism and the contemporary stuff, because he doesn't really feature in that discourse anywhere. And so that sparked my interest in this concept. And then I came across a very well-known and influential, in fact, review by Jürgen Habermas of Bloch's earlier book, Das Prinzip Hoffnung, which Habermas published in 1960, just after the final volume of Das Prinzip Hoffnung came out, where he develops a critique of Bloch's speculative materialism, which is the term that he uses there. And on the basis of three main arguments, really, which pertain to Bloch's ontology, his epistemology, and his politics, hence the subtitle of my book. And the thrust of Habermas's critique, which he bases, as I've sort of indicated, on Das Prinzip Hoffnung, is that Bloch develops a materialist ontology that is romantic and heavily influenced by Schelling's nature philosophy, and doesn't have anything to do, Habermas is clear to point out, with Hegel, for whom he's a good guy. Hegel is a good guy for Habermas in that story. Habermas also argues that Bloch's epistemological position is a kind of naive realism, which goes hand in hand with Schelling's, speculative account of nature with a big N, is a pre-Kantian theory of knowledge, is Habermas's argument. And he argues that Bloch's politics are totalitarian. And he has this wonderful image of Lenin dressed in Gothic rags, as he puts it, which sounds, as I've said elsewhere, like a version of Les Miserables that nobody wants to watch. So these three critiques, the sort of naive realism, nature philosophy as an ontology, and political totalitarianism, I was reading Das Materialismusproblem at the time and thought, this doesn't stick with doesn't really fit with what I've taken away from that book. So I began writing my own account of Bloch's speculative materialism and its relation to its historical context, but also to the then contemporary context of speculative realism and materialism. I'm not going to say much more about the content of the book because I think that's going to come out in the discussion, I hope. But that's where it began.
Thank you. Helena, would you like to come in? Oh, unmute.
Right. So first of all, congratulations to Cat for writing this book. I think it's a serious, substantial, very thoughtful book. I like the way it combines intellectual history with philosophical analysis. I also like the way it brings texts which were written decades ago into dialogue with various contemporary theories, especially the speculative turn, new materialism, and eco-Marxism. So I think that's really quite interesting. Now, for a start, I want to put right out there that I haven't read Bloch in a very long time. And I haven't paid that much attention to Bloch in my own work. So this book made me interrogate myself about why was that? And so my questions and comments I'm going to raise now stem from that kind of interrogation of myself and a kind of the challenge that this book posed to me about that. But I want to start first with just the most basic of questions that I think might be helpful to anybody listening here who hasn't read the book, but maybe also to people that have. It's basically, what is speculative materialism? Now, Cat, you've written thousands of words, I realize, about this, and I read them, but I still think it might be a good idea if you could state here as concisely as you possibly can, what is the speculative in speculative materialism, and how it's different from other forms of materialism, particularly other forms of Marxist materialism. Now, my second question is what you make a passing reference to Bloch's involvement in the Comintern debates on science, which really puzzled me because I thought I knew everything about Comintern debates on science and who participated in this. Everything from, the big debates, big dialectics of nature debates stemming from the controversies about Lukács's history and class consciousness, the Soviet debates on mechanism versus Deborahnism, all kinds of other debates that I hunted down in the Comintern period about the role of science in relation to Marxism. And unless, this research is decades ago, so I might have forgotten something, but, it doesn't come out in my writing that Bloch was a player in this. So somehow he didn't present himself to me as a player in this. I'd just really like you to expand on this and enlighten me about it. So from there, I want to go to the GDR and Bloch's period there. I'm particularly interested in philosophy in the GDR, and I've had a lot of involvement as a philosopher with philosophy in the GDR. So I wonder if, apart from Bloch's critique of the blatant dogmatism of a certain period and the political tensions surrounding that, I want to know, do you think that there was any justification for the philosophical critique of Bloch in the GDR? And that is that he represented a tendency to revert to an idealism that was superseded by Marxism. Now, I realized that the situation for philosophy was very difficult at the time that Bloch was there. The GDR, but I just want to put it out there, the GDR felt itself under siege. And it saw itself engaged in a life or death battle for socialism in practice. And it saw a battle for Marxism in theory as essential to this. Now, I know that doesn't in any way excuse the rigidity and dogmatism and the way people like Bloch were dealt with. But I think it does explain the kind of hothouse atmosphere surrounding the intellectual life of the GDR during this period. And you mentioned in relation to this period, Wolfgang Harek. And I'd just like to relate that I spoke to Wolfgang Harek at length over several days in Vienna in 1979. He had been in prison and he had not been out of prison that long. But he was also a philosopher who got into trouble at this time. To my surprise, Harek defended his imprisonment to me. It was a long conversation over several days. I'll never forget some of the things he said, and I've written a longer account of this in my book, Navigating the Zeitgeist, so I'm not going to go through it here. But basically, he said that his ideas about social democracy were dangerous at the time because of the conditions of the time, and that it was important to defend itself. And even if the party wasn't electable, it was still what was best for the people. And he said he felt this even now that he was out of prison and wasn't anymore living in the GDR. He said he felt even more strongly about this because he had become, even at that time, very preoccupied with the ecological crisis. And he said that this generated imperatives that demanded strong and centralized and even authoritarian action. So I just thought it was interesting to mention Harek in that context. But I've had an ongoing relation to philosophy and to philosophers in the GDR. Some who are mentioned by Cat in this book. Manfred Bohr, for example, was the director of the Institute of Philosophy and my relationship to the GDR is primarily through the Institute of Philosophy. And also Klaus Fuchs-Katowski, whom I think you mentioned, who actually defended Bloch in terms of the controversies of the time. Who's the nephew of the atomic spy, Klaus Fuchs. But my strongest relationship was with the section for philosophical problems of the natural sciences of the Academy of Sciences. And at one time, I was at a seminar there where Bloch was discussed. And one person stated very adamantly that Bloch was not a Marxist, whereas other philosophers there, took a much more nuanced position about Bloch and his relation to Marxism. But one thing they did seem to agree on, if I remember this seminar correctly, was that they didn't think he really had a clue about science. They did not defend repressive measures of the party against Bloch or Habermas or Biermann or Barrow or any of that. But themselves, they tried to find a way to do serious and honest work in philosophy without being dissidents. And it was a very difficult tightrope sometimes for them. But they were genuinely loyal to the GDR, and they weren't really doing this for opportunist reasons. And I've kept in touch with these people long after the end of the GDR now, and they're still Marxists, even though it's not only not a career advantage, but absolutely the opposite. So I also got the impression from them, and also from other indicators, including a few things that Cat mentions in the book, that the Bloch somehow floated at a level above things, that he lived in this world of texts and ideas that didn't have much, and he didn't really have that much in the way of activist involvement. I mean, obviously he took political positions, including very difficult political positions that cost him a lot, particularly, his defense of the Soviet Union when he was in the US, which was no small thing to do. And obviously his life was buffeted by various political forces. But, his non-alignment with any party, his choice of exile in the US rather than the USSR, his failure to learn English or to involve himself in anything when he was in the US, his final choice of the FRG over the GDR, these things they're kind of obstacles to me to admire him, if I put it as simply as that. To me, I've always believed that Marxist intellectuals should be activists in a way that Bloch doesn't seem to me to have been. Now, the final area that I want to interrogate about Bloch is that I'd like Cat's opinion about why Bloch has been so popular all these years among liberal theologians and radical intellectuals who can't accept materialism. That these have always been the circles in which I've seen Bloch serve as a source of inspiration and insight. Now, when I first read Bloch myself decades ago, it was when I was on my way to becoming a Marxist, but not yet a Marxist. And then since I became a Marxist, I somehow felt I had less and less reason to go to Bloch for inspiration and insight. And even recently, this autumn, I was at a conference of the Society for the Social Studies of Science in Toronto, well, on a platform like Zoom, actually. But there was a paper that was delivered at this conference on post-secular science, which was heavily citing Bloch and Paracelsus. And I've given a lot of thought over the years, and particularly in recent years, as to what kind of science do we need? And post-secular science is not anything that occurs to me that we need. And again, this comes down to materialism. So, but this is what I've found over the years is typical of the context where I see Bloch popping up and why I didn't see him so much as part of the stream of Marxism, where I found my inspiration and my own place. Now, I admit, Cat, that your book actually pulls in the opposite direction from what I'm saying here. And I that's why I'd particularly like you to comment further about, about how, Bloch, this notion I've had about Bloch mightn't be entirely justified. Your book actually makes a fair case, pulling in the other direction. So that's basically what I want to say. I don't mean to be too negative, and what I'm doing here, I'm only airing doubts, notions, and impressions. Not hard arguments. I mean, I'm well capable of going with hard arguments, but that isn't what I'm putting forward here. I freely admit I don't know Bloch in the way that Cat does, and probably in the way that the other participants in this seminar do. So I'm happy for you to push back against what I'm saying here and to be corrected.
Cat, are you going to come in and talk about Bloch as warm Marxist, or what it means to be an activist, and pick up on some of Helena's really interesting, challenging questions?
Yeah, and they are interesting and challenging. And, Helena's book on Marxism and the philosophy of science is one of the books that, I found really essential when I was writing this, and still find essential on these debates now. So it's really helpful for me and great to have you put these questions to the book. What is speculative materialism? Well, let's start there, because that is indeed a good question. And although I spend a lot of pages talking about this thing, I think one could be forgiven at the end of reading the book for posing that question, because I state in different ways what I think this term means in Bloch. But to bring it down to the basics, for Bloch, speculative materialism is a claim, a thesis about the nature of reality, of material reality, for which he uses the shorthand term matter, which states that matter is the kind of foundational substance on which nature and history, including human history, are based, and from which they issue, is speculatively constructed. And that has two components to it. So on the one hand, he argues that the concept of matter is a concept, and it's speculatively constructed because it is it doesn't appear empirically in the world. So in that, he sort of follows along from Engels and Lenin, who describe matter as a concept and nowhere present in empirical reality. But based on the speculative construction of this concept, he argues that reality itself is a speculative process, which is to say that this matter that he posits as the sort of basic structure of our world is indeed a kind of processual agent that realizes itself and limits itself in its own self-realization, and has a kind of tendency within it to push towards finality or some kind of identity with itself. And so this is a big cosmological claim, right? But one of the reasons that Bloch wants to make this claim is because he wants to offer a materialist account of human consciousness and the existence of mind within the framework of a materialist, including a Marxist materialist philosophy. I'll come back to that in a moment, because that connects to debates in and around the Comintern on the philosophy of science. But so speculative materialism is a thesis about matter, a dialectically or speculatively constructed material world that is sort of that emerges out of what Bloch calls a not, or a lack, or an absence, and produces material structures, that including those that haven't yet been actualized. So he talks about matter as composed of two tendencies: being in possibility, which is the sort of, one might think of it as like a repository of all possible possibilities, and being according to possibility. And he sort of borrows these terms from Aristotle. And being according to possibility is the self-actualization of the material process according to limits that have already been set by itself. And this conception kind of maps onto Schelling's understanding of nature as composed of natura naturans and natura naturata, so the sort of subjective component and objectified component of nature, or the natural process. And in the book, I argue with Habermas about the extent to which Bloch is a Schellingian, but perhaps we can come back to that a bit later on. So Bloch argues that matter is a process of self-realizing possibility and self-limiting in its realization of possibility. And the ultimate possibility that he thinks the material process is tending towards is, to put it bluntly, the realization of something like communism. He posits that the emergence of human beings, human thought, human consciousness, humans as praxis-oriented beings that are capable of intervening in and guiding this process of material self-realization, is a movement towards the achievement of the possible communist society. So that's the kind of, Bloch situates the idea of communism in this grand kind of cosmological narrative that he develops there. how is this different from, I mean, I can say more about the content and during the course of our discussion, but how is that different from other Marxist positions? I mean, it seems to me to be quite different from many other sort of strands of Marxism. I mean, Marx himself is not especially concerned with the concept of matter at all, it seems to me. Engels more so, particularly in Dialectics of Nature, and obviously later discussions around that book continue that. Somebody like Sartre writes at some length in Critique of Dialectical Reason about matter and its meaning and its nature. Althusser, perhaps, in his work on aleatory materialism, discusses the concept also, but from a rather less humanistic perspective than Bloch. So I think Bloch's position is distinctive in a number of respects, and it also is, bears some interesting parallels with the speculative materialism of Quentin Meillassoux, but is based on quite distinct coordinates from Meillassoux' philosophical coordinates. Meillassoux' materialism is really a kind of Cartesian materialism of matter as extension, and his concept of speculation is really a pre-Kantian understanding of the capacity for human thought to access a mind-independent reality. And as you know very well, Helena, these arguments are part of the story of the reception of Dialectics of Nature and the political discussion around ontology and epistemology within internationalist Marxism in the 20th century also. So Bloch intervenes in those debates with this book, Das Materialismusproblem. To what extent is that an intervention in Comintern debates? Well, in the sense, if one means by that, an intervention in the debate under the banner of Marxism between Deborah and Stepanov and other interlocutors, well, Bloch does not intervene in that debate. He isn't anywhere to be found there, as you rightly said. He doesn't intervene in it directly. He writes Das Materialismusproblem in the mid-1930s, by which time the discussion on mechanism and dialectics has already been decided, in 1929 at the Congress of Soviet Scientists. The Deborahite faction was the sort of previous status quo, according to which mechanism was considered the official doctrine and Deborahnism was rejected, was reversed. And so the mechanists had kind of won out at this point in the early 1930s. And Bloch is writing in the context of a growing opposition on his part to Stalinism, and a feeling that the mechanistic dimensions of what he considered to be orthodox Marxism were hampering freedoms of thought, of action, of practice, and so forth, and also failed, in a sense, to explain the existence of mind as of mind and of human will as a kind of crucial component to the possibility of human praxis. So he's trying to offer an account of the emergence of mind in a materialist framework that bolsters his belief that that a mechanistic conception doesn't really capture that. And so in the preface to Das Materialismusproblem, Bloch refers to this debate within the Comintern, so he's aware of it, and I argue in the book, positions his book obliquely, if you like, and indeed post facto as an intervention in that discussion. So Bloch writes this book writes Das Materialismusproblem in the mid-1930s. It isn't published until 1972, by which time he's living in West Germany, having stayed in the West in 1961. He was visiting Tübingen as a Gastprofessor, and when he and Carola, his wife, found out that the wall had been built, they decided not to return to the GDR. But he lived in the GDR, as you rightly point out, for 12 years. When he returned from the USA, from his exile in the USA in 1949, it was to take up a professorship at the University of Leipzig in philosophy. His first job, by the way, his first ever academic job. And he stayed there until 61. So he was there for 12 years. And in the first years, I mean, first of all, you know, I'm very interested in this period in Bloch's biography and in his intellectual career. And I've been rather interested in some of the writing on DDR-Philosophie in the German context, which I think is really helpful in sort of contextualizing some of these aspects of Bloch's thought. And so I would like to, on another occasion, hear more about your encounters there. But in the first, I mean, what I would say is that in the first years of Bloch's residence in the GDR, he, you know, things went rather smoothly. He was hired in Leipzig, both because he was seen to be, you know, enough of a Marxist to be viable, and because he was sort of not particularly a prominent figure in a certain kind of way in the East. And so, and so in the first years of his career there, things went rather smoothly. He didn't put his head above the parapet too seriously. He was very uncritical of the party, which he never joined, as you point out. But he didn't really exercise much critique. In 1951, he gives a lecture in Leipzig called Parteilichkeit in Wissenschaft und Welt, so partisanship in science and in the world, where he, you know, very dutifully, one might say, makes the case for partisanship in history and the necessity of partisanship in ideological terms, arguing, you know, very clearly for the labor point of view in relation to the sciences and to philosophy. In 1953, at the time of the uprising, you know, he remains silent. He didn't exercise any critique of the regime at all. It's only really after 56 when, well, there are two things that create waves for Bloch in the GDR. One is the publication of his book on Hegel in 1951, Subjekt-Objekt-Erläuterungen zu Hegel, which argued against sort of received wisdom in that context, that Marxism and Marxist thought was not, had not been exhausted or overcome, Hegelian thought had not been exhausted or been overcome by Marxism, and that there was still significant, you know, legacy to be had from reading Hegel. And in his lectures at the University of Leipzig, Bloch taught classical German philosophy from the get-go, which was recognized by his students as a politically contentious move. But so the Hegel book sparked controversy, but not until much later, and indeed until after 1956 and the publication of Khrushchev's secret speech, which Bloch reacted to with, you know, shock and disappointment. And at that point, he started to be more critical of the SED. He organized or co-organized an event on academic freedom in Berlin in that same year. And in the aftermath of that, there was a discussion around the sort of validity of Bloch's position. In April 57, a roundtable was held on whether or not Bloch was, considered ideologically correct, and that was all organized by Rutger Otto Popp, among other people, who was one of his sort of main opponents in the discussion of his book on Hegel in the pages of the Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie, which he had helped to found and was one of the co-editors of with Harich and Baumgarten and Karl Schröter. And so the trajectory of his time in the GDR goes from relative harmony to a situation in which in December 1957 he was removed from his post and so forth as for being considered un-Marxist, and was denounced in a tribunal as such. Was there any justification for the intellectual criticisms of Bloch, is your question, as clinging to a kind of superseded idealism? I think you make a really strong point that the situation in the GDR was one of real or perceived political defensiveness and the necessity for a certain kind of political defensiveness. I don't subscribe, neither as an intellectual nor as a Marxist, to a kind of Whig historical view of the development of the history of ideas, according to which, one body of thought definitively supersedes a preceding one. And I think Bloch didn't either. And so he found his conception of history was more similar to that of somebody like Walter Benjamin. He saw the past as a kind of active field of struggle in the present, the value of the past and what past ideas mean as always in the present, a scene, a site of struggle. And so he was keen to enlist, anyone he could in that, on the side of social emancipation and, his brand of Marxism. Which brings me to the final point that you made. One can debate. I think the thing about Bloch, which is fascinating and frustrating in some respects, I think you're right in your characterization of him as somebody who was always a little bit on the outside of orthodoxy, or of some kind of vision of what it means to belong to a certain kind of position. So Detlef Horster, in his little introductory book on Bloch, says that Marxists who tend to be so divided are almost universally united on the fact that Bloch wasn't a Marxist. But among his critical theory contemporaries, people like Adorno and Horkheimer and so on, he was considered to be too communist. Those are Horkheimer's actual words when he didn't, in a letter sort of explaining why he didn't want to employ Bloch at the Institute in exile. So Bloch had difficulty on that front, but he saw himself as a Marxist, and I think I see him as that too. Even though one criticism of his sort of grand cosmological perspective is that it doesn't have very much to do with history. But I tend to agree with Wayne Hudson, who has described Bloch's metaphysical perspective as an activist metaphysics. He wants a kind of theory that can ground the possibility of practical action in political struggle. I want to stop talking, but I will just say a word about theology. So why has Bloch been so popular among theologians? like Jürgen Moltmann in the Protestant context, like Johann Baptist Metz in the Catholic context, like liberation theologists, Gustavo Gutierrez and so on. I mean, one reason I think is that Bloch was interested in religion, which not all Marxists are. And he believed that, Esther mentioned this term warm stream Marxism, and Bloch identified himself with one of what he saw as the streams within Marxism, a cold stream, which is sort of analytical and economically focused and so forth, and a warm stream, which is focused on the cultural and what in certain discourses, religious discourses, might be called the spiritual dimension of human life, the affective dimension also. And he felt that Marxists need to take seriously not just economic arguments, not just numbers and figures arguments, but also indeed the emotional and affective dimensions of the human experience, and that they need to mobilize those things in order to in order to engage people in social change. In his book from 1923 already on Thomas Münzer, the leader of the German Peasants' War, Bloch discusses these issues. And he's interested in Münzer not as a theologian. He's interested in Münzer as a political actor and as a political instigator, as a heretic in the political sense of the word. And he sees Münzer and the history of sort of radical millenarism as a kind of communism before the fact. So he sees those kinds of religious movements that strive for social change as communism that hasn't understood itself yet. And so I think that's one of the main reasons why why theologians have been interested in Bloch, is simply because he talks about some of the themes that are of interest to them. But somebody like Gutierrez, one of the main architects of liberation theology, also when he was at university in, I think, Louvain, studied Marx, studied Freud, studied Darwin in ways that actually brought him into conflict with his own peers. And so there are places where I think the histories of, religious social struggle and a kind of Marxism that has immanentized the eschaton, to use that phrase that was so beloved of American conservatives in the mid-20th century, are not so far apart. And that's certainly what Bloch thought in any case.
Thank you, Cat. I think for interests of time, we'll move to Sebastian's contribution, bring him in now.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for that, Cat. That's plenty of food for thought and lots to go on there already. I just wanted to start by congratulating you on what I think is really an extraordinary book and a terrific resource, I think, for many of us working on this context that you began to touch on towards the end there, which is this kind of peculiar moment in German Jewish thought, right, of thinkers who are on the one hand, I think, thoroughly estranged, from a tradition into which they were born, but who found themselves politicized and radicalized in a certain moment in the history of Germany that I think invited them or prompted them to read, this tradition in a different way, in a way that is revolutionary or comes to be inflected by kind of anarchist or communist currents. And Bloch, oddly, from my perspective, as somebody who's spent a good deal of time working on figures like Adorno and Benjamin, is a kind of a specter in this conversation. I think he's very often in the footnotes as the older friend, whom people had encountered, during their exile in Switzerland or elsewhere or in the United States. But who has received, at least in the Anglophone sphere, I think, relatively little attention in his own right, which is a shame. And especially this text, which, for reasons that you outline in your book, including the fact that it hasn't been translated, this Materialismus book. So this is a particularly interesting one. I also think that your decision to kind of, make much of your exposition turn on these three, let's call them categories, right, that Habermas picks up on in this influential review is helpful. It's this interplay of epistemology, ontology, and politics, I'm quite interested in the way that you bring these three to bear on each other. It's like you're articulating or re-articulating a set of philosophical concerns in different registers, which I think really illuminate each other in helpful ways. So it's an interesting kind of way to reconstruct the larger set of concerns and contexts with which Bloch was dealing and in which he was engaged from the standpoint of this particular books and its three at least layers or registers. So I think this is very helpful. I also wanted to compliment you, if I may. So it's going to sound like I'm gushing. Permit me, yeah, indulge me. I wanted to congratulate you, I think, on a really useful pacing of the book. It kind of, zooms in and out very usefully, yeah, between very succinct and I think often helpful summaries of, at times, relatively obscure, at least to my mind, kind of debates from the history of the Comintern and its relationship to philosophies of science. Yeah. Summing those up, and then moving into close kind of textual analyses of Bloch's work, which are interesting in that regard. It prompted me to think of a few things, really, well, lots of things. One of them, a very naive, really extremely naive question that maybe I just want to front load, which is, to what extent bad politics necessarily follows from bad philosophy, if you like. You know what I mean? The kind of polemics that Bloch was engaging in, where he's asking this, asking more of the philosophical premises on which some of the politics that is surrounding him, kind of rests, and what that relationship really is. I mean, it's quite a fundamental question, I guess, about the relationship between theory and praxis. I have two textual questions, I think, more textual questions, as Helena anticipated them earlier, which I was hoping to put to you. I've written them out so I don't go rambling too much. I hope you'll allow that. So the first of them is as follows. It is also to do with these kind of debates around the philosophy of science and Bloch's response to, kind of ideas that had been debated in the Communist International. Early in your book, you frame your reconstruction of Bloch's speculative materialism by showing how his effort is in part to do with reconnecting Marxism to its sort of dialogue with classical German thought, with Hegel in particular. As you point out, this is, amongst many other things, a kind of polemical gesture, right? Insofar as philosophy had itself become a sort of ideological battleground for Marxism, insofar as the dominant view of the Comintern during the 20s and 30s had, by all accounts, become that real existing socialism of the Soviet caste had in fact practically overcome or superseded or sublated the bourgeois legacy of Kant, Hegel, and Schelling, so that there was really no more need for speculation of this kind or arguably any kind. The idea of a speculative materialism then was bound to appear as a kind of contradiction in terms, right? Insofar as it turned on a sort of metaphysical operation, namely on the construction of a concept of matter grasped in its sort of universal dimension. And if I understood you correctly, part of the point is that Bloch's speculative construction of a concept of matter is intended as a sort of indirect criticism of, for example, Lenin, whose book of materialism on materialism and empirio-criticism, in essence outlined a sort of theory of reflection, right, to assert the primacy of matter over and above anything that might look vaguely like bourgeois subjectivism. And so it struck me that this is a slightly circuitous route to safeguarding, as I think Lenin intended, a sort of political disposition towards praxis, but maybe that's by the by. But Bloch's recovery of Hegel and Schelling in connection with materialism in this context, I think calls to mind a sort of optical metaphor, I guess, that connects speculation and reflection, which is to do with the fact that both stem from the semantic field of vision, right, of sight and seeing. They connote a thinking, I think, at least as Lenin presents it, if I recall, in images, in images of one sort or another. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about how you see the connection between Bloch's speculative materialism, Lenin's quasi kind of Epicurean theory of reflection, and the role that images play in Bloch's thought more generally. What's the status of images in Bloch's speculative materialism? I have a little follow-up on that if you'd care to comment in anticipation of your response, which is an invitation to say a little bit more about the role of Bogdanov and his reading of Ernst Bloch in this connection, which I think is interesting. I have a second question as well. Would you like me to roll that out now, or Yeah, okay, good stuff. Second question. In the second chapter of your book, the one on ontology, I think, you describe very persuasively, to my mind, the processual character of Bloch's ontology, which has everything to do with his view of the material world as kind of constitutively incomplete, right? And hence as in principle completable through a certain view of, I guess, praxis, the political dimension of Bloch's epistemological reflections on an ontological problem, right? And it's connected closely to Bloch's most central idea, namely that of, or, that most famously associated with his name, perhaps, namely that of utopia. I'm going to quote you back to yourself for a moment. You write, since Bloch saw the process of material actualization as essentially incomplete, the Aristotelian categories of potentiality, dynamis, and actuality, energia and entelecheia, converge in his ontology, such that matter becomes a name for the process in and through which what is potential is actualized. Thus, the idea emerges that there may be a material end or telos to this process, an end that, following Bloch's logic, must be present as potentiality within the material process itself, even if what that goal is has yet to become determined. It's on page 67. And you elaborate on this elsewhere. This is just one line on page 58, a little earlier, actually. Key to Bloch's speculative materialism is thus the concept of ontological incompleteness. The material world is utopian in that it is literally not yet there or complete, but is rather in a process of desire-driven becoming. I was very interested to see that you put some of these comments under a chapter heading that I suspect you, or maybe it was Bloch himself, borrowed, at least I think that's the order of events, borrowed from Walter Benjamin's lost fragment, Teleology without ends, Teleologie ohne Endzweck, which was, of course, part of a cycle on politics that Benjamin had begun to develop whilst studying in Switzerland during the late 1910s, which is also where he met Bloch. Is there a tension here, now this is my question, between the prospective completion of a constitutively incomplete material world as a utopian telos of sorts, and the process-based character of matter, in which you might say that the journey is, in a sense, the goal, right? So those are my two questions to you, and I invite any and all of your thoughts or comments.
So, Cat, are you going to come back in on questions of the continuation or not of speculation, the role of Bogdanov, the idea of the image within this, and ontological completeness?
Great questions and big questions. I mean, this, in a way, so the point about bad or good politics and philosophy is an interesting one, I think, because it seems to me that there's a sense in some of these debates around, so to sort of summarize what I think the debate, the broad debate about the philosophy of science in the context of not just the Comintern, but Marxism hinged on, it was this question of access to the real, human knowledge's access to the real. To what extent do we have access to the in itself? To what extent is the world as it really exists perceptible by us? To what extent is our knowledge a reflection of reality? And that's the reflection theory of knowledge that you referred to in your questions. And let's just say that from a certain kind of orthodox perspective, the reflection theory of knowledge was taken as taken to be valid. And that puts us in a position in which if you get your ontology right, your good politics will follow, right? Because if one has the possibility to perceive the way the world really is, then it's a question of being politically correct is a question of being ontologically correct. And being ontologically correct might mean being a mechanist, or it might mean being a dialectician, or, depending on which phase of the debate one is intervening in. today, I think we're very far away from that conception, right? I think that the idea that one can read a politics off of an ontology is sort of no longer very plausible. But that a lot of what I'm going to say in my answer kind of hinges on that point. In terms of the supersession of philosophy, and it's a question that Helena raised as well, you know, Sebastian, very well that the opening lines of Adorno's negative dialectics deal with this very problem, right? Philosophy that was once thought to have been overcome is still relevant because what it was aiming for, namely some form of universal liberation, has not taken place. And I think I place Bloch very much in the same spirit as Adorno on this point. You know, he sees that universal emancipation is not a reality, and he therefore believes that philosophy and theory have a part to play in achieving it. Okay, what does that mean concretely speaking? This discussion around speculative materialism, reflection theory of knowledge, and images, and a little bit on Bogdanov. So one of Habermas's central arguments against Bloch is that he defends a pre-Kantian epistemological point of view, that his arguments about the nature of matter and so forth presuppose a kind of pre-Kantian epistemology, i.e. a reflection theory of knowledge, which is both something that Habermas claimed had been superseded from the point of view of non-Marxist or Western Marxist critical theory, and was still being practiced or being practiced again by Orthodox Marxists or Soviet Marxists. That's Habermas's kind of claim in a nutshell. And the fact that Bloch is, in his view, clinging to that, puts him in either or both of those categories, which is not somewhere you want to be from Habermas's point of view. What I tried to argue in the book is that I think Bloch walks an epistemological line somewhere between Kantian criticism and Hegelian conceptual realism. Bloch was, formed intellectually in an atmosphere in which neo-Kantianism was very present. And although he takes issue with aspects of that philosophical perspective, particularly in his 1908 dissertation on Heinrich Rickert, where he engages critically with neo-Kantianism, he's nevertheless influenced by it. In his early work, Geist der Utopie, already there, Bloch talks about needing to make Kant burn through Hegel. So he's trying to walk a line between the two of them, and I'll say a bit more about that. So if Kant's, major insight when it comes to the nature of knowledge is that we don't have access to the in itself, that our knowledge of the world, or the way the world is structured through our experience of it, the way the world appears to us is structured through our experience of it, is not a transparent access that we have, or an unmediated access. Bloch, I think, basically agrees with that, but he also has a reading of Hegel that comes rather close to some contemporary readings that emphasize this idea of conceptual realism. So for a long time, Hegel was seen as a sort of metaphysical, re-metaphysicalization of the problem, in contrast to Kant, asserting the identity of thought and being, asserting the unmediated nature of knowledge, of an in itself. And that was the kind of metaphysical Hegel that has been long since done away with in the work of people like Robert Brandom and Robert Pippin and many others since then, who have emphasized the continuity of Hegel's thought with that of Kant, namely the idea that concepts are socially and historically constructed, and that there is a subjective component in the construction of concepts. However, there's another possible reading of Hegel on this problem, and I think it's the one Bloch comes closest to, is to read Hegel as a conceptual realist. So Bloch quotes, and I quote it in the book, a long passage from Hegel's Encyclopedia Logic, where he talks about phenomena such as lightning and gravity and so forth, and asks, how are we to understand these things? Natural kinds, natural laws, essentially, are the two classes of things he talks about. He says, if we, his point is, if we want to take science seriously when it tells us that an apple is always going to fall from a tree, or, a human is always going to give birth to a human child, then we need to take seriously the proposition that our conceptual relation to the world does have some kind of imperfect access to the in itself, that it's not completely a complete sort of rupture between the two spheres. Seems, in a way, it sounds sort of banal to restate these things from a contemporary perspective in which subject-object theories of knowledge have been roundly kind of, criticized from all sorts of perspectives, but that's the basic problem that Bloch is trying to intervene in. And so I argue in the book that he walks a line between these two positions. On the one hand, he does believe with Kant that human knowledge is limited, but on the other hand, he thinks that we'd have some sort of minimal mediated conceptual access to the real. And you put the question to me about images and the role that images play in this. And I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but I do talk in the book about language and Bloch's sort of self-conscious performative use of literary language to express his, in which to express his philosophy. Because of course, that is itself a demonstration of the fact, in the sort of post-romantic vein, that knowledge, if language is sort of taken as a substitute or a vehicle for knowledge here, doesn't have, cannot express the absolute, and therefore has to resort, this is the romantic, classic, romantic posture, has to resort to fragmentation, to becoming poetry, essentially, in order to more authentically convey the nature of the reality that it wants to portray. So I argue in the book that Bloch's use of literary language actually, in a certain kind of way, proves is continuity with the Kantian project, even though he does have this conceptual realist dimension, which enables him to make substantive claims, in his view, about the nature of matter and or the historical process. But so processual ontology and utopia, teleology without a telos, yeah, that subtitle is sort of cribbed from Benjamin. So, as I've already said, the basic thesis of Bloch's speculative materialism is to do with this kind of ontological incompleteness, and the idea of a finality inherent in the process he draws from Hegel and Hegel's concept of sort of the logic of reality. But I think so. Your question was, is there a tension between the desire for the process to be completed and this idea that the journey is the process itself? And the idea of teleology without a telos is probably worth saying a little bit more about, because indeed, for Bloch, the natural historical, human historical process does have a direction. He just talks about an invariant of direction, which is to say a kind of temporality, not linear, but a directed temporality. And there is a goal, as he describes it, latent in the possibilities, the infinite possibilities contained within the material process itself. But what would the achievement of that goal then really mean? If the process, which is constitutive, is indeed processual. And I think that is just an irresolvable tension. I mean, Bloch is very careful to point out that the content of whatever the sort of ultimate goal of this process might be is itself not yet determined and has to be worked out in, among other things, the process of political struggle. He does say some minimal things about it, like that it involves universal freedom and the abolition of oppression and so forth. But those are rather vague descriptions. I haven't found a way to reconcile those two opposing that tension. Basically, I think it is just there in Bloch, and in a way, the fact that I see his metaphysics as an activist metaphysics means that one, in his eyes, probably shouldn't worry too much about that tension, because it's a question of engaging in the process first and foremost. But yeah, that's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. Let's bring Thomas in to the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Also, I mean, after all these questions by Helena and Sebastian, it's always difficult, if impossible, to follow up. And I can't stop thinking about what Kolakowski said in his piece on utopia, that in completion, so that utopia has also an epistemological condition, namely also epistemology has to be incompleted in order for utopia to be brought forward. And this could also be an interesting dialogue. So Bloch's ontological incompleteness with Kolakowski's epistemological incompleteness, despite those differences in the notion of utopia that those two had. And which would also funny underlying the two of the three notions of your subtitle, like actually. I mean, I do not have to repeat what Esther and Helena and Sebastian said about the book. At some point, you never have enough of Bloch, so it is always good to have a book on Bloch, especially if the book is not museal or doesn't have an archiving function. I loved the last chapter on new materialisms, eco-Marxism, speculative materialism on Alamiyasu. I found it extremely interesting how we can have all these discussions. I will try and concentrate on a discussion of the question concerning conceptually the understanding of materialism that seems to shine through your book, and then try and ask on the second part what kind of political consequences this could have, and especially in regard to materialism or the understanding of materialism that you bring forward. I mean, I love the fact, I found it extremely concise and amazingly inclusive how you managed to summarize all these very difficult debates among especially the German philosophers from the Vormärz until Bloch's time. I found it impressive how you managed to put them on the paper, and how you were able to give us a compass on how to navigate between all those debates. And for me, what it seems to me to become interesting here is that materialism could be considered as a way of thinking, and therefore also as a way of practice that poses the different many against the unilaterality of even the supra-individual one. And in the concepts that you have in your materialism chapter, so from Haeckel's new Spinozist monism, as the connection of the two sides of body and spirit, to Engels' critique of scientific materialists who, to quote Engels in the English translation, lump together and neglect the qualitative differences of things, to Adorno, who was opposed to any concept that might suggest, and here I quote you, that might suggest, quote, subsuming material difference under the ideal guise of sameness, end of quote. To Bloch, of course, who saw in solidification the most undialectical of fates. What I think that we have here is an attempt to address materialism as a way to conceptualize not only difference or otherhood, but more importantly, difference and otherhood in community with the self and the I. And my question is, where do you think that such an understanding of materialism would be able to obviate, if not overcome, problems that have always haunted materialist thinking? And would you argue that there are insights in Bloch, like the beginning of the spirit of utopia that you also quote in the book, I am, we are, that is enough, now we must begin, that could advocate such an understanding of materialism that promotes a collectivity of differences? And this brings me to my second question, namely on the practical political consequences of such an understanding of materialism that becomes extremely important, I think, when we go back to readdress or understand what has always been Bloch's catchword, namely utopia. And I mean, you mentioned already when answering Helena's question on the notion of speculation, speculativity. I agree with you definitely that speculation demonstrates, as you put it in your own words, the ability of human thought to go beyond the merely empirical and paves thereby the way for a different and better way of social life that is, again, in your and Bloch's words, objectively possible. Now, Bloch does not sketch, or at least to my knowledge, substantially what this different and better life should look like. He argues merely in quotation mark that this is against all odds and critique possible. And my question is, how are we to understand nowadays what such a utopia could look like? I mean, the political forms and especially the actors that could bring forth, that could help realize this objectively possible utopia. And especially when looking at the end of your book, where you address in your materialism, speculative materialism, and eco-Marxism, of course, in your understanding of what utopia would mean, this would be, of course, this would be a place, world, a topos, at any case, that is not anthropomorphizing anymore, where the distinction between human and non-human is no longer tenable, longer where forms of labor are equally addressed and included, and a world where the body does not function as the pre-social affective vector of emancipation. And just mention a couple of qualities that I think you would agree, and I think that we find in Bloch's understanding of what a utopia would look like. I would like to ask you, this is my final contribution here, whether this world that to a certain extent is not yet could be argued as already existing in a fragmented way, again, in an incomplete, therefore also fragmented way. So does Blochs not yet entail partially already here? And what I have in mind is not just an idea of utopia or of a collective utopia as koinotopia, maybe, that realizes the collectivity at the core of materialist thinking. But what I have in mind is if we could also see, if we could also argue that Bloch's understanding of utopia prefigures what has started in the recent years to become prominent, namely the notion of prefigurative politics. An anarchist, going back to an anarchist tradition, maybe not as Marxist as Bloch, but I don't know if at this point this is interesting. And I mean, you know, prefigurative politics now pertain to the main core is that there is a direct experimental actualization of a social and political alternative as an inherent part of activist practice, and that now and the future are already united in the present. So do you think that there could be, in Bloch's understanding of utopia as a not yet such a prefiguration, an already realized, prefigured, emancipated maybe even future? Thank you.
There's some nice questions there about the I and the we, and a lot about utopia today, prefiguration, and the meaning of the not yet as the potentially fragmented here. So let's hear what you have to say, Cat.
Again, thanks, Thomas, for those really great questions. You know, I feel like when I'm answering these questions, there's so much that I like to say, and it feels difficult to sort of pin down in some cases a very precise answer, both in relation to...
To be honest, sorry, I mean, to be honest, the best part of the book, of reading the book, is actually that you gave us so much to think of. I mean, it's not necessarily what we read in the book, but what we expect to read in the second book or in the next book or books, you know, so...
Well, that is very kind, and I guess I better get busy if I want to come good on that promise. So your first sort of question, I'll try and say a few things, and I think some of what you alluded to points back to Sebastian's question that I didn't really answer about images as well. So one thing I've said many times already tonight, that Bloch's conception of matter cosmologically, politically, is that there's that it can constitutes a kind of striving towards identity. I've used that word identity with itself, which would signal some kind of, resolution. He writes at one point in Das Materialismusproblem, something is missing. If it weren't the case, then there wouldn't be any process, right? So there wouldn't be any movement, change, if there were already a kind of identity in place that would equal stasis for him. And so, although there's a lot of emphasis on this concept of identity in Bloch, both in my book and in other people's writing about him, in fact, in practice, what that means is that his philosophy is de facto a philosophy of difference. The present is characterized by difference, and that is for him also a sort of essential to materialism, as you put it. In one of his later books, Experimentum Mundi, where he tries to develop a kind of materialist logic of processual categories, he talks about the multiversum, which is a category that both describes our actual situation and also is supposed to apply for Bloch to the post-utopian scenario. So indeed, what he's imagining in this achievement of identity is not, and perhaps this also does go back to help me answer in a bit more detail Sebastian's question about the tension between telos and process. The goal of this identity that he argues is aimed at in speculative materialism is not stasis or a kind of identity without difference. It is a form of identity in difference, or unity in difference, collectivity in difference, even in the kind of the post-utopian context. And there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, obviously, in discussions around things like intersectionality, with and or versus solidarity, this is one of the issues that sometimes comes up. Solidarity is, in a way, a kind of action with others despite what their differences from you, right? It's class solidarity is something that's supposed to transcend other kinds of differences, or underlie or cut across other kinds of differences. And perhaps one can say that about solidarity in a general way, that political action as a collective is about being solidary with others who are different from oneself. So I think Bloch's philosophy definitely has something to say about that in the present, in the sense that it is a philosophy of difference. You're right in saying that he doesn't say too much in detail about what the utopian future is supposed to look like, in good company with other Marxists and with other utopians of non-Marxist persuasion. It's an issue, the question of whether or not to form images of the better world is, of course, one that divided him and Adorno. It's one that Sebastian talks about at length in his book in relation to Adorno. And the difference between them is Adorno clings more closely to this idea that creating an image of something already binds it into a kind of blueprint that quickly becomes programmatic and tendentially authoritarian. His name for that is, as you pointed to, identity thinking, and at points, including in that very well-known interview with him and Bloch, Something's Missing, he appears to tar Bloch with that brush also of an identity thinker, although, as I've said, I think that is can be challenged. In my book, and also in another piece that I published in the Hegel Bulletin on this topic, I bring Bloch and Adorno into conversation on this point because their interpretations of Hegel and this the question of the ban on images hinges on this in a way. Their sort of differential reception of Hegel after 1945 takes on a certain kind of political significance, because Adorno is very keen to push back against what he calls identity thinking and conceptual, identity thinking is inherent in conceptual thinking for Adorno, because he explains that dynamic, the dynamic of bringing multiple particulars that are in fleshly reality non-identical and subsuming them under the guise of sameness in that quote, is one of the things that contributed to the Nazi genocide. The idea of being able to see the other as an instance of a type and not as an individual with all that means. And so Adorno's critique of identity thinking is articulated in that context. Bloch, on the other hand, is working in a slightly different context, and I argue in that piece that his advocacy for what Adorno calls identity thinking, what he calls speculative thinking, or the speculative, constructive, positive moment of thought, is important when one realizes that in the GDR context where Bloch is writing at that point, thought that sort of pushed back against the status quo, went beyond the status quo, was not always welcome. And we've talked already a little bit about the nuances of that context, but the idea that there was another ideological context in which the quashing of speculative thought and thinking about possibilities and painting positive pictures of what might be a better world was not necessarily welcome, because it highlighted deficiencies with the social reality of the moment. In that interview between Bloch and Adorno eventually sort of comes round to Bloch's point of view and says, maybe actually in the moment of social struggle, one does have to create positive images of what is one's fighting for. Otherwise, it's very difficult to mobilize people. Okay, so I hope that sort of answers some of that question about difference and collectivity and images of the better world, of the utopian world. The question of the not yet and how, to what extent that entails the partially already here. That's really important, and in one word, I would say that Bloch's not yet definitely entails a certain kind of relation to what is already here. Somebody in the group might be able to remember. There's somebody who, and it's not that American philosopher from the 20th century, but this phrase "basic communism." Is one that I've come across in the not too distant past, which sort of talks about the communistic tendencies inherent in everyday situations, like family love or collegial interaction, friendship, and so forth. Bloch is very preoccupied with everyday images, everyday experiences, the daydream, the pleasure that one can get from, making from fashion, indeed, from things that seem very everyday. And so, indeed, the not yet does kind of entail what is already there. I mean, prefigurative politics, it seems to me that this idea of prefigurative politics has been at the heart of the politics of socialist and communist organizations for some time. The question of whether or not the aim of such organizations is to prefigure a certain kind of society within the organization itself. So I think that's been around for a while. What you were talking about sounded to me like something a little different, but like all utopian thinkers, Bloch is concerned with the tradition, right? The tradition of utopian thought, of utopian practice. And his idea of the not yet is also very concerned with what he calls cultural surplus. So he argues that in every, moment of, struggle for emancipation, or also artistic production and so forth, that what is attempted and not achieved is sort of carried over into the next generation. And so when he goes searching for images for what a future redeemed society might look like, he looks to the past a lot of the time, and to the utopian images of the past, whether in art and literature, in religious traditions, in the everyday, or in the political sphere. And so there's this sense in which, if one can't know prefiguratively what the future is going to look like, one can see where the desires of the past have been expressed and what form they've taken, and mobilize those or reactivate those in the present. And that's his hermeneutic, essentially. I'm going to say one last thing about the body, because it just stuck out as one of the sort of areas in which you I'd like to say a lot more about, Bloch's relation to new materialism and eco-Marxism, but I think we don't have all the time in the world for that. But on this point about universalism and difference, I think the body is probably a helpful place to finish. I read Bloch in Das Materialismusproblem, but also in some of his other works, as being quite close to Walter Benjamin's concept of anthropological materialism. And what I mean by that is to say that, so just as Benjamin sort of felt that the Marxist emphasis on the constructedness of material reality missed something about the embodied experience, the universalism of embodied experience, and particularly oppressed embodied experience, right? Historical change is sort of created by, subjective practice and so forth. But in every particular moment, the tradition of the oppressed is one in which one's body is at risk of being damaged, or one's life is at risk of being diminished or ended by conditions of social inequality. And one experiences that in and through one's body. And this sort of fact of having an embodied life, even though the form that our bodies take is radically different, and also historically the way that we see those bodies is radically different, the fact of having an embodied life that is susceptible to being diminished or ended is a kind of universalism in difference that I think underpins Benjamin's anthropological materialism, and that I think is also present in the sort of political dimension of Bloch's speculative materialism. And I mean, that clearly speaks to, political struggles of now, just as it did to those of that time. But I might finish speaking and we can wrap up or questions or whatever.
I'm aware that Cat has been speaking for a long time, but there's no getting out of the hot seat, unfortunately. But we have questions from the audience. But I also think that the other panel members should also come in and contribute and respond as well, if just to stop this feeling like Cat's having a viva again. Sebastian, did you want to say something now?
Yeah, thanks for the responses, Cat. That was very enlightening. I wanted to follow up on something that you said earlier about lack, about things missing, right? As the nice Brechtian phrase goes. You know that one of the criticisms that was leveled at Meillassoux in his Après la finitude, right, is that that there's no sense of agency in the spontaneous and total transformation that he proposes, right, in this move from being to may being, or whatever the maneuver was. Would you say that a sense of lack, or maybe put inversely, a kind of desire, is the kind of engine, the driving force, the agent of Bloch's conception of kind of history? Is that what's driving things? Is that what's missing in Meillassoux, by contrast, so to speak?
I mean, short answer, yes. So the kind of the desire-driven structure of material nature and the desire-driven structure of human consciousness are, the question of lack and the centrality of desire is what connects these two spheres for Bloch. So there's a certain transitivity between the natural history and human history, connected by the fact that both are driven by desire, and the desire to realize certain kinds of possibility. Meillassoux is an interesting contrast, and indeed the sort of lack of agency point is a criticism that I make of his version of speculative materialism vis-a-vis Bloch's in the book. Meillassoux sort of also draws this big cosmological arc and says, but his starting point is slightly different. He sort of says, okay, we live in a material world in which there isn't, anything necessarily living or willing in matter itself, but there is this sort of process of temporality, which brings forth different worlds, as he calls them, in the Divine in Existence project, out of one another. So there's a world of matter, then there's a world of life, and there's a world of consciousness, and eventually there'll be what he calls a world of justice, that are brought forth spontaneously and ex nihilo, as he puts it, in the kind of material context. And he sees the appearance of, as Bloch does, the sort of the human being with its willingness or consciousness of the possibility of justice as a crucial part of that story. But there's no relation between the desire for justice, or the awareness of the possibility of justice, and the sort of utterly arbitrary, in a certain kind of way, temporality that may or may not bring about that new world. And that is both that, the fact of that, this sort of disjuncture between the two realms, is due to the different coordinates that they take in their speculative materialism. Bloch is able to talk about possibility and real possibility because he has a dialectical concept of both of matter and of our relationship to it in knowledge and in praxis. And Meillassoux doesn't have the same structure. So I think desire is important, and it is different, and it is key to this problem of agency as I see it, in Meillassoux.
Anyone else on the panel wish to come in? Or should we take the first audience question I've got here is from Jonathan Roller. Could you say a few words about Bloch's idea of the resurrection of nature, or about the role of nature, the Mitproduktivität der Natur in general for Bloch?
So thanks to Jonathan for that question, which leads on a little bit from what I was just saying to Sebastian about this sort of the transitivity between the natural and the human, and the kind of sort of double imbrication of those two realms in one another. So Bloch transposes Schelling's idea of a subject of nature, which he develops in his 3 works on the philosophy of nature, end of the 18th century, into a new context. The subject of the process of development is no longer nature, but as we've already seen, matter for Bloch. But the subjectivity, or the subjective factor, which is present both in pre-conscious natural processes of realization, and once consciousness emerges, present at a qualitatively transformed level, or in a qualitatively transformed way in human historical processes, is what connects those two spheres. And so this idea of a Mitproduktivität der Natur follows from that connection in subjectivity between the human sort of willing, thinking, laboring human being, and a nature which not only has brought us forth in some kind of way with all of our dreams and hopes and cultural products, but is capable itself of subjective, creative action. And so Bloch envisages in a very speculative way a potential collaboration between humanity and nature through technological media, in a kind of something approaching, I guess, a kind of steady state economy situation. And this is where in the book I sort of try and connect his argument about Mitproduktivität der Natur with contemporary eco-Marxist writing by people like Jason Moore and John Bellamy Foster, as a way of signaling Bloch's, possible contribution to those debates of how we might think differently about using, or not using, but engaging with natural productivity and natural potentialities in ways that don't seek to exhaust resources or exhaust energies, but rather to sort of regenerate or work more cyclically with them. I hope that's something of an answer to Jonathan's question.
Maybe this is extended also through Ralph E. Lecture's question around how Bloch's view of science and nature compares to Marcuse's romantic view, as he puts it.
Oh, that's the question that I really don't feel up to answering in much detail. I'm really sorry, Ralph, but I mean, Marcuse and Bloch, I suppose, both have that kind of romantic anti-capitalist underpinning, but I haven't read Marcuse recently enough to sort of to say much of use, I think, on that point. The Ilyenkov connection, I'm just reading Ralph's question now as well. The Ilyenkov connection is of interest. That would be of interest to me as well. And I think that's Paul's response. That would be of interest to me as well. I attended a very excellent talk on Ilyenkov the other day by a student here, Georgi Kiobadze, and he seems like a very interesting figure, but I'm afraid I don't have a better answer for Ralph. Sorry. Esther, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, there's very lively debate going on in the chat around all of these questions, which we'll all look at later. But let's move to Charles Wolf's question then. To what extent is an ontological materialism necessary or at least crucial in a materialist politics? The common thought would be not very, but the Blochian story seems increasingly different. I guess that's something we keep sort of circling around, isn't it? What is the use of this for a Marxist or revolutionary politics? So would you like to comment, or any others on the panel like to come in on this point?
I'll say one or two sentences about that, and then maybe others have some contribution to make as well. But I mean, in a way, this is this question goes back to the fact that we all have metaphysical presuppositions, whether or not we acknowledge them. We're all always informed by some vision of how action might be possible, for example, in the social context and in the material context, the environmental context. And so is an ontological, is some kind of explicit work to how ontological materialist theory necessary in order to be politically active? No, I don't think so. Nor can, as I've already said, we read off a politics from an ontology in a sort of one-for-one correspondence kind of way. But I think what Bloch is keen to point out is that, I mean, it's also an anti-defeatist position. He wants to argue that success in the struggle is possible, and here is why. That's his sort of gesture, if you like, of offering this rather speculative cosmological or metaphysical underpinning for his thought. Do we need that? No, not necessarily. But do we operate with something like that implicitly? I would say yes, with some version of an ontology, not necessarily this one, of course.
And Jonathan Rössler has come back with another question. Is there a connection between Bloch, Heidegger and consorts and the general idea of a re-establishment of philosophy as metaphysics, the study of being, or is it just a mere historical correlation? So are there concrete links, would you say?
I mean, Bloch and Heidegger, as far as I know, only met once. And apparently, I think I read about this in a piece written, sort of an anecdote in a piece written by Jan Robert Bloch, Bloch's son, that they talked about Meister Eckhart, that they were very, that was their topic of conversation. Bloch wrote one or two texts in which he was critical of Heideggerian thinking, and yet there are some sorts of similarities between the early thought. So in Manfred Riedel's nice classic book on Bloch, Tradition und Utopie, he argues that Bloch's Geist der Utopie from 1918 sort of, is kind of moving in the territory of the Seinsfrage in a certain kind of way, because it's a discussion of the temporality of being in its existential dimensions, but also in relation to what that means for history, for transgenerational transmission of memory, of in the political sense, and so forth. I don't think that Bloch wants to return to sort of philosophy as fundamental metaphysics situation. That is in a way the critique that Habermas makes of him, and I don't think I agree with that. But he also does in Das Materialismusproblem, there's a lengthy section on materialism as a he doesn't say like secular form of metaphysics, but as a kind of anti-theological form of metaphysics. And in that, I think he essentially makes the argument that we just discussed about how we all operate with these assumptions, and materialism today can perhaps act as a form of non-committal metaphysics. But
as it's been brought up in the chat, and I'm also aware Helena went first, and a lot of water has passed under the Blochian bridge. I wondered if you would like to come back in and say whether you feel Cat's responses met your questions, or whether there's still this persistent sense of idealism, of a non-materialism around Bloch. I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily, but it would be good to hear. People would like to hear.
Well, the book itself, as well as the discussion, has definitely pulled against that sense that I had of, Bloch being so much the darling of theologians that, who is he to those of us who have made our choice for materialism. The whole discussion has pulled against that, as has the book. Still, there's still a kind of lingering doubt there about why Bloch has been so embraced by the type of people who want to evade the implications of materialism, and not taken as seriously by the people who have embraced materialism. I think there's more to that. But you have pulled me a bit away from that. But on the question of the relationship between, I want to say something about the relationship between ontology and politics. And I've been politically active for a very long time now. I've met all kinds of people who are politically active with different relationships to philosophy. But I personally need to have a strong and well worked out integration between philosophy and politics. I've needed it almost like food and water my whole life. And people that I've met along the way, many are like that, but many aren't like that. But you're also right to emphasize that even with the ones who don't seem to be like that, there is an implicit ontology in epistemology. People do need working assumptions, to do all the practical things from one day to the next, let alone be politically active.
I'd just like to say thanks to Helena for that comment, and I'm glad that the book and the discussion was able to at least offer some different, to offer some hope for Bloch as a valuable interlocutor in not just interlocutor, but part of what I hope to achieve with the book is to show that Bloch is a serious, offers serious potential for Marxist thought and practice still. And I hope that, I achieved that to at least some extent. So.
One of the things I was just stimulated by a comment from Ralph where he's saying, heritage of our time, the society is worth more than, the ontological, the sort of cosmological, the kind of scheme building. I was thinking that's an interesting point. I mean, I myself have always been, much more drawn to that fragmentary approach, but of course it's also intervening. Is it concretely intervening? It certainly is addressing an urgent question of fascism, and through the cultural plane and through the plane of existence and so on. Can it be separated off from the materialism project though, or is this all coming from the same place? It just articulates differently. One feels fragmentary, the other feels massive, vast, and difficult to sort of navigate within in some ways. That may not be why Ralph doesn't like it, and that's me sort of voicing my sort of sense of what attracts me through Bloch.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also attracted by or convinced by the kind of, concrete meta level engagements of Bloch with culture and with anti-fascist politics from the 1930s. I mean, Erbschaft dieser Zeit is indeed a really great book that reiterates in numerous ways the point that was made earlier, that Bloch sort of wants to mobilize the cultural, the affective, the emotional in the fight against fascism, not only sort of what he considered to be sort of cold economic arguments. And, one of his main claims in that book is that was one of the reasons why fascism was gaining ground, was that it was able to speak to those elements of people's existence. But that book, I mean, turns on the sort of centerpiece of that book is a reflection on Ungleichzeitigkeit, on as you know very well, like on multi-temporal dialectics. So for Bloch, I don't think there's any strict separation between the political, the cultural analysis and the sort of bigger philosophical questions, whether about his temporality of history or at this level, the sort of structure of the material. I don't think there's any separation for him.
Would any of the panel like to come back in, make any final comments? Sebastian?
I don't know if it needs to be a final comment, but I wanted to circle back to the point that Jonathan Rössler mentioned earlier about potential parallels with Heidegger. And it always seems to me that, despite their evident, outward kind of political tendencies that point so much in the opposite direction between Bloch and Heidegger, you could say something similar about Adorno and Heidegger or Benjamin and Heidegger. I think they share in some fairly general way similar, they have in common certain premises concerning the critique of modernity more generally. And I think that is to do in all three of their cases with interesting and in their nuances, obviously different conceptions of time, including this idea of non-simultaneity, which is, I think, not a million miles from certain things that Heidegger has to say in Being and Time. They're obviously mobilized in the service of different kind of agendas, shall we put it? Yeah, but I think this idea that there's something fundamentally awry in what has been called, in a certain register kind of subject-object relationship, which is something that you can get at through conceptualizing or reconceptualizing a certain kind of ontology, and that these are ultimately epistemological, philosophical questions of a kind that play out in a political register, yeah, in one sense or another. This, I think, they have in common. Yeah, there's a kind of an Unbehagen, right? A sense of unease in the sense that we inhabit this world, in the sense that we inhabit also our bodies, as it were. And I think you can put this kind of consideration, which I think would have been very present to Bloch in his more expressionist phase or in his more kind of more pointedly Marxist moments. I think you can put that in the service of a certain conception of politics, which you can think of in factional terms, I guess. But I suppose it's about overhauling what we mean by politics altogether, or what we mean by a kind of a community of, living beings or something like that. It's about, the mode in which we inhabit and negotiate a world, right? To put it in a Heideggerian idiom. And I think if you zoom out, right, then in that sense, they do have plenty to say to each other. It's a philosophical overhaul of philosophy as such, and what that says about what it means to live in a world of one form or another. And then funneled into a kind of political conversation about what mode of community that might mean or entail, which obviously for Heidegger and Bloch wind up being quite different.
I think that's a really good point, and a negotiation about a world and about a future as well. And, I think the experience of, so both Being and Time and Geist der Utopie appear within Bloch's Geist der Utopie appears at the end of the First World War, and Being and Time less than 10 years after the end of that war. And, indeed, the experience of that conflict fragilized a lot of those questions. And I think those two books sit in that context, yeah.
Thomas, would you like to come in?
Yeah, it goes a little back also to the discussion that also Sebastian and Cat already had on desire and desire and not. And with Lacan, of course, I cannot stop thinking of Lacan the whole time. And it would be interesting to see, if Bloch also prefigures Lacan, who also would have, and then of course, the other figure that I always have in mind is Laplanche when it comes to this, and especially with utopia. I was thinking, what is the substance of need and desire for Bloch? Because for the big metaphysical systems like Hegel, for example, then desire would be the desire for the desire. At least this is Kojève's and Hippolyte's interpretation. And I think that in order to be able to uphold this incompleteness on the level of desire, then desire should be the desire of the other. And this is where Laplanche comes in. So, wo ich war, soll der andere werden. Where there was the I, there must become always the other. And this would also keep up this difference actually at work. So this is actually what would break the circle of identification. Not the imagination of the other, but the possibilization that there will always be an other to be desired and to fantasize. Not fantasy is not a word here, but to make a utopia out of it. I would just be very cautious here in this point, because then the other must not become a utopia. As a utopia must be the other, because I think that then we would leave this Marxist materialist understanding of the other, and we would move in the direction of metaphysical thinking of the other that would be also paradigmatically wrong, and to be honest, to a certain extent, maybe also politically wrong. But this was not even a halfway well-articulated comment. It was what was going on in my head. So on this case, as concerning desire.
I mean, I think my answer isn't going to be super neat either, but with that, I think I do see parallels between Bloch and Lacan. The connecting figure is obviously Hegel and the concept of Begierde. And the movement from I to we in a kind of Hegelian model is obviously predicated on the establishment of recognitive practices, of the institutionalization of recognitive practices, and how that sort of connects to this perpetual deferral of something, some form of equality that goes beyond the level of recognition is an interesting one, I think. In the Kojevian reading, the sort of desire begetting desire story does foreclose any possibility of, reconciliation or achievement of some kind of more egalitarian configuration of others, which opens up, to my mind, it's that kind of desire begetting desire story that opens up the danger that you pointed to of whatever you want to call it, fetishization of the other or so forth, seeing the other not as an equal, but as some version of, above or below oneself. That's also not a very tight answer, but I think that it's in any case and in any reading, desire is clearly one of the constitutive factors of this not, which for Bloch is the kind of primary, is the beginning, let's say. But it's not only desire, because it's also a protest. That there's in his conception of the not, there's also a protest against stasis and against, the status quo, and that's what is at the heart of processuality. So, yeah, sorry to take it like abstract again.
So, I've experienced the non-simultaneity of watching this on YouTube, where Cat is still talking, and on here, and experienced the cosmological thing of watching nightfall in Dublin, which has been really beautiful, and now there's these gorgeous lights behind, and possibly some of the arguments in the chat testify to I and we thinking, I don't know, but I think it just remains to say, wow, Cat, amazing book and an amazing performance. Your endurance is really to be celebrated, and as you will see in the chat, so many people want you to continue under your new circumstances. So thank you to the audience, and we hope you stick with HM, Haymarket, come back, do more stuff. And thank you also very, very much to Thomas and Helena and Sebastian for their brilliant and close, careful readings and questions. So good night, everyone.